My stepmother spent 3 years meticulously photoshopping me out of every single family vacation photo on the mantle. She thought she was erasing my presence from the house. She didn't realize she was actually erasing her name from a $40 million inheritance. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and the temperature seems to drop 10 degrees. That was my life every time I stepped through the front doors of the estate. My father, Arthur, was a man of industry, shipping, logistics, the kind of things that make a person wealthy enough to forget what a grocery store looks like. He wasn't a bad man, just a busy one. When my mother passed away 10 years ago, the silence in our home was deafening. So when Diane arrived 3 years later, I actually wanted to like her. I wanted the noise back. The house was a sprawling, modern architectural marvel in the hills, all floor-to-ceiling glass and polished marble. It was beautiful, but it was cold. I was 22, finishing my degree in estate law. Ironic, I know, and living in the East Wing. I tried to be the good daughter. I brought her coffee, I remembered her birthday, and I stepped back to give her and my father space to build their new life. But Diane didn't want space. She wanted a vacuum. That's when I noticed the first change. It started small. A framed photo of me and my dad at my high school graduation was moved from the hallway to a dusty shelf in the library. Then it disappeared entirely. When I asked Diane about it, she gave me that smile, the one that doesn't reach her eyes, the one that says, "Oh honey, don't be so sensitive. It just didn't fit the new aesthetic, Claire." She'd say, smoothing her perfectly tailored skirt, "We're updating the decor. You understand, don't you?" But the update was specific. Diane began commissioning these massive, high-gloss canvas prints from their travel trips to Amalfi, skiing in Gstaad, summers in Provence. I was there for every single one of those trips. I remembered the heat of the Italian sun, the smell of the pine trees. I remembered standing right between my father and Diane for the group shots. One afternoon, while my father was in Singapore on business, the new prints arrived. I walked into the Grand Gallery and saw the photo from our trip to the Maldives. There was my father, looking tan and relaxed. There was Diane, glowing in a white linen dress. And there, right where I had been standing, where my shoulder should have been touching my father's, was a perfectly rendered, crystal-clear expanse of turquoise ocean. I wasn't just cropped out. I was digitally scrubbed. The shadow I cast on the sand was gone. The reflection of my blue dress in my father's sunglasses had been painstakingly edited to show only the sky. It was professional-grade erasure. At first, I thought it was just a petty play for attention. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where I used to be. I felt a strange mix of nausea and a cold, sharpening clarity. Diane walked in then, clicking across the marble in her heels, holding a glass of Chardonnay. She didn't even look at me. She just looked at the photo and sighed with contentment. "Doesn't it look cleaner?" she whispered. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I'm an estate law student. I've learned that the person who loses their temper loses the case. Instead, I looked down at the silver locket I always wore, a gift from my biological mother. Inside was a tiny, hand-painted portrait of her. Diane hated that locket. She'd accidentally tried to send it to the cleaners in my coat pocket twice. I tucked the locket under my shirt, feeling the cold metal against my skin. I realized then that Diane wasn't just decorating. She was rebranding the family. In her mind, if there was no evidence of the first wife's daughter, then the inheritance would have no reason to split. Then I realized what was actually happening behind closed doors. A week later, I was in my father's study looking for a stapler when I saw a folder on his desk. It was a draft for a new will. My father's health had been fluctuating, and Diane had been the one helping him organize his affairs. I opened it, expecting to see the usual 50-50 split or a trust arrangement. My heart stopped. Not only was my name missing from the primary beneficiaries, but there was a clause specific. Nasty little line that claimed I had already received my full share through a series of offshore gifts that I knew for a fact didn't exist. She wasn't just editing me out of the photos anymore. She was editing me out of my father's legacy, and she was using forged documentation to do it. I heard the heavy oak door creak behind me. Looking for something? Clear. Diane's voice was like silk over a blade. I turned around, the forged will still in my hand, and saw her standing there with a look of pure, triumphant malice. She wasn't hiding it anymore. You can stay for dinner, she said, but you might want to start packing. This house is getting a little crowded. I looked from the papers to her face, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel sad. I felt a surge of cold, calculating energy. She thought she was the only one who knew how to rewrite a story. You're right, Diane, I said, my voice eerily calm. It is crowded. And I think it's time we cleared some things out. I walked past her, the silver locket heavy against my chest, already thinking about the addendum I was going to draft. The dinner that night was the quietest meal of my life. The only sound was the rhythmic clink of sterling silver against fine bone china, sound that usually felt like luxury but now felt like a countdown. Diane sat at the head of the table, my father's usual spot, since he was still recovering from a bout of exhaustion in the master suite upstairs. She sipped her wine, her eyes tracking my every movement with the predatory stillness of a cat watching a bird it had already cornered. She thought she had one. In her mind, that draft of the will was the final nail in the coffin of my inheritance. She assumed that because I was young, because I was grieving my mother, and because I had always been the quiet daughter, I would simply fold. She expected a tearful confrontation, a plea for mercy, or perhaps a dramatic exit. She didn't realize that while she was busy playing House Beautiful with Photoshop, I was finishing my final year of law school with a specialization in forensic accounting and estate litigation. That's when I noticed something strange about the gifts after dinner. I didn't pack a suitcase. I went to my room, locked the door, and opened my laptop. I had taken a high-resolution photo of that forged document with my phone while Diane's back was turned. I zoomed in on the offshore gift addendum. The document claimed I had received a series of payments totaling $6 million over the last 24 months, disbursements from a shell company called Azure Tide Holdings. I felt a cold prickle of recognition. Azure Tide. I had seen that name before, but not in my father's ledger. It was on a piece of mail Diane had tried to hide under a pile of fashion magazines 3 months ago. I began to dig. Using the university's access to legal databases and a few favors from a friend in digital forensics, I started tracing the paper trail Diane had manufactured. It was clever, I'll give her that. She had set up the shell company in my name using a forged power of attorney. On paper, it looked like I was draining my father's accounts behind his back. At first, I thought it was just a simple frame job. But as I looked deeper into the timestamps of the transfers, I realized Diane had made a fatal error. She was greedy. She wasn't just making it look like I was taking the money. She was actually moving the money into an account she controlled, thinking she could blame the theft on me once my father passed. She was erasing me from the photos to psychologically prepare my father for my betrayal. If I wasn't in the pictures, I wasn't in his heart. If I wasn't in his heart, he wouldn't question the theft. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen reflecting off my silver locket. I could go to my father right now. I could show him the screen. But he was frail, his heart was weak, and Diane was his primary caregiver. If I triggered a heart attack now, she'd claim the estate under the current will before the forgery was ever proven in court. No, I needed a more surgical approach. I needed to let her think her plan was working perfectly. I needed her to feel so secure that she became careless. The next morning, I acted exactly how Diane expected. I walked into the breakfast nook with dark circles under my eyes, looking defeated. I didn't look her in the eye. I kept my voice small. "I've decided to spend the next month at the lake house," I murmured, staring at my coffee. "I think I need some space too. Figure out my next steps." Diane's face transformed. The mask of the concerned stepmother slid back on, though it was thinner than usual. "Oh, Claire. I think that's a wonderful idea. Healing takes time. Don't worry about the house, I'll take care of your father. I'll make sure he understands you just need a break." "Thank you, Diane," I said. I reached out and touched her hand, a rare moment of contact. She flinched slightly, but allowed it. "You've really thought of everything, haven't you?" Then I realized what was happening in the shadows as I packed over the next few hours. I wasn't folding sweaters. I was installing for pinhole cameras in the gallery and the study. I also did something much more dangerous. I accessed the house's central server. Diane had recently hired a digital archiving firm to catalog the family's history, the same firm that had been erasing me from the photos. I found their contact info in the kitchen drawer. I called them, pretending to be Diane's personal assistant. "Mrs. Sterling wants to make a last-minute change to the anniversary gala presentation," I told the technician. "She wants to surprise Sterling. We're going to swap the new family reel for a legacy reel. I'll be sending over the new files shortly." The technician didn't suspect a thing. Why would he? I had all the account numbers. For the next 3 days, I worked like a ghost. I spent my lake house time in a small motel 3 towns over, buried in spreadsheets and video editing software. I wasn't just looking at the money Diane stole. I was looking at what she used it for. She had been buying properties in her sister's name. She had been donating to charities that were actually private foundations she chaired. She was building a life that didn't include my father or his daughter. That's when I noticed something strange about the final photo. While scrolling through the archive of the erased photos the firm had sent me, I found the original file for the Maldives trip in the raw data. I saw something Diane's editor had missed. In the background of the shot, reflected in a glass sliding door of the beach hut, was Diane. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at her phone. And she was smiling not at my father, but at a man standing just out of frame, someone who definitely wasn't part of our family. I did a reverse image search on the man's face. He was a lifestyle consultant she had hired a year ago. A man who had been receiving consulting fees from Azure Tide Holdings. The narrative was complete. Diane wasn't just a gold digger, she was a traitor. And she was about to host the 30th anniversary gala for Sterling Shipping, the biggest social event of the year. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. 500 of the most influential people in the industry were there. My father, looking pale but upright in a tuxedo, was seated on a velvet chair on the stage. Diane stood beside him, draped in emerald silk and wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than my 4-year tuition. I arrived late. I didn't wear black, the color of a mourner. I wore a shimmering silver gown that matched my mother's locket. When I walked into the ballroom, I saw Diane's wine glass pause halfway to her lips. Her eyes widened. She hadn't expected me to show up, let alone look like this. I didn't go to her. I went straight to my father. I leaned down and kissed his cheek. "Happy anniversary, Dad," I whispered. "Claire," he rasped, his eyes brightening. "Diane said you were unwell." "I've never been better," I said, catching Diane's gaze across the room. I gave her a small, knowing nod. At first, I thought she was going to cause a scene. Instead, she signaled the event coordinator. It was time for the legacy tribute, the slideshow Diane had curated to show the world the new, improved Sterling family. The lights dimmed. The room went silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diane said into the microphone, her voice honey-sweet. to 30 years of sterling shipping, and to the beautiful, private moments that make a house a home. The first image flashed onto the massive 40-foot LED screen. It was the Maldives photo, but it wasn't the version Diane had ordered. The screen flickered for a second, a glitch of static, and then the erased version disappeared. In its place, the original photo appeared. There I was, standing proudly next to my father. And then the image zoomed in not on us, but on the reflection in the glass. The room gasped as the image of Diane smiling at her consultant was blown up for 500 people to see. Then I realized what was happening on the stage. Diane froze. She turned to the tech booth, waving her arms frantically. But the presentation didn't stop. It wasn't just a slideshow anymore. The next slide wasn't a photo at all. It was a high-resolution scan of the forged will, read. Circles appeared around the fraudulent signatures. A voiceover began, not a professional narrator, but a recording of Diane herself from 2 nights ago, captured by the pinhole camera in the study. He's getting weaker, Marcus. Her voice echoed through the ballroom speakers. Crystal clear. The girl is gone once he signs the final draft. The Azure Tide accounts are ours. He won't even realize he's leaving her nothing. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. My father turned his head slowly toward his wife, his face a mask of shattered trust and burgeoning rage. Diane's face went from emerald green to a sickly, chalky white. She looked at the screen, then at the crowd, then at me. That's when I noticed something strange. I whispered, loud enough for those in the front row to hear. The photos weren't the only thing you couldn't quite keep hidden, Diane. The legacy tribute transitioned into its final phase. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. A direct feed from the Azure Tide accounts, showing the real-time transfer of sterling shipping funds into the private accounts of Diane's consultant. The murmurs in the crowd turned into a roar. Several of my father's board members stood up. 2 men in dark suits, actual investigators I had tipped off 3 days prior, began walking down the center aisle toward the stage. Diane tried to bolt. She stepped off the stage, her heels clicking frantically, but the crowd didn't part for her this time. They closed in, a wall of indignant socialites and angry business partners. Arthur, it's a fabrication, she shrieked, looking back at my father. She's a law student. She's manipulated the files. It's deepfake technology. My father didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He looked at the screen. Where a photo of my mother, the original Mrs. Sterling, now sat. It was a photo Diane had tried to burn, but I had saved. I stepped forward, meeting Diane in the middle of the floor. The investigators were only 10 feet away. You told me the house was getting crowded, Diane, I said, my voice steady and cold. I agreed. So I decided to do some spring cleaning. She lunged for me, a desperate, unrefined move that showed the world exactly who she was beneath the silk and diamonds. But she never reached me. The investigators caught her arms, her emerald dress snagging on the corner of a table as they began to lead her out. But the real twist was just beginning. As she was being escorted toward the double doors, the screen changed one last time. It wasn't a photo or a bank statement. It was a legal document stamped and filed that morning. It was a restraining order and an immediate petition for annulment based on fraud. But it was the bottom of the document that made the room erupt again. My father hadn't just signed it. He had authorized me as his sole legal representative. I watched as the door swung shut behind her. The invisible daughter was the only one left standing in the light. I turned back to the room, to the 500 people staring at me in awe and shock. I picked up a glass of water, not wine, and looked at my father. He was shaken, yes, but he looked lighter. For the first time in 3 years, the House of Glass felt like it might actually become a home again. Sometimes, I said to the silent crowd, you don't need to fight for your place in the picture. You just need to make sure the truth is in high definition. I thought that was the end of the story. But then I looked at my father's phone, which was buzzing on the table next to him. The weight of the room had shifted. The air, once thick with the suffocating perfume of Diane's expensive lilies and the stagnant pretense of a perfect marriage, suddenly felt sharp, clean. The hum of the ballroom's ventilation system seemed to grow louder in the vacuum of silence that followed Diane's forced exit. My father was looking at his phone. His hands, usually steady enough to sign multi-million-dollar shipping manifests without a tremor, were shaking. The screen was glowing, casting a pale, ghostly light against his weathered face. That's when I noticed something strange about his expression. It wasn't just shock. It wasn't tea. Just the heart-wrenching realization that the woman he shared a bed with was a digital assassin. It was something else, a flicker of recognition, followed by a profound, hollow sadness. "Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Look." I stepped toward him. My silver dress shimmering under the harsh stage lights, I took the phone from his hand. It was an incoming FaceTime call. The caller ID didn't have a name, just a string of encrypted numbers. But the thumbnail image associated with the contact was a photo I hadn't seen in 15 years. It was a candid shot of my mother, laughing in the garden of our old summer house, her hair windblown and her eyes bright with a secret joy. It was a photo that had been lost in the fire that claimed our guest cottage years ago. At first, I thought it was a cruel parting gift from Diane. I pressed accept. The screen didn't show a face. It showed a darkened room, illuminated only by the rhythmic blinking of server towers. Then, a voice came through, distorted, digitized, but carrying a cadence that made the hair on my arms stand up. "The files are moved." "Claire," the voice said, "the Azure Tide accounts are frozen. The cleanup is complete." I looked at my father. He was staring at the phone as if it were a portal to another dimension. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A friend of your mother's," the voice replied. "And someone who has been watching Diane since the day she stepped into that house." "Your mother knew, Claire." "She knew that in a world of glass and marble, the only thing that lasts is the data." The call ended. The screen went black. The gala didn't end with a bang. It ended with the slow, methodical efficiency of a crime scene. The guests were ushered out by security, polite, firm, and silent. The Pierre Hotel's ballroom, which moments ago was a theater of high society drama, was now just a cavernous room filled with half-eaten lobster and abandoned champagne. My father and I sat at the head table. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the 40-foot LED screen, which now displayed a simple, elegant logo of Sterling Shipping. "I thought I was being careful, Claire," he said, finally looking at me. "I thought I was protecting you by letting her manage the clutter. I didn't want you burdened by the politics of this life." "You weren't protecting me, Dad," I said, sitting beside him. "You were letting her erase me. There's a difference." He nodded slowly, a single tear tracking through the wrinkles of his cheek. "She told me you were resentful. She showed me emails from you, angry, demanding money, saying you hated what I'd become." I didn't want to believe them, but they looked so real. Then I realized what was happening in the digital shadows. Diane hadn't just used Photoshop for the pictures. She had used AI-generated voice synthesis and deepfake text generators to create an entire history of conflict between us. She had built a digital wall between a father and a daughter. Brick by fraudulent brick, the gift she told you I was taking, I asked, the $6 million from Azure Tide. She said you were gambling it away in Macau, he whispered. She showed me the bank transfers with your digital signature. I felt a surge of cold fury. It wasn't just about the money or the photos. It was about the 3 years of my life I had spent feeling like an outsider in my own home, wondering why my father had grown so cold, so distant. She had stolen our relationship and replaced it with a script of her own making. That's when I noticed a detail I had overlooked in my own investigation. I pulled up the Azure Tide records on my laptop one last time. I looked at the metadata of the gifts Diane had supposedly sent me. Every single transfer had been initiated from a device located inside the house but not Diane's laptop. They were initiated from the smart home hub in the kitchen. Diane was clever, but she was a narcissist. She thought she was the smartest person in the room, which meant she assumed no one would ever look at the boring stuff, the automated logs of the house itself. I checked the hub's history. On the nights the transfers were made, the house's security system recorded Diane entering the kitchen at 3 a.m., but there was something else. Every time she accessed the hub, a secondary command was sent to the digital archive firm. She wasn't just erasing me from the photos, she was uploading my mother's old digital assets, emails, voice recordings, old videos into a private server. Dad, I said, my heart hammering. She wasn't just trying to get rid of me. She was trying to replace Mom. The next 48 hours were a blur of legal filings and forensic deep dives. Diane was in custody, held without bail due to the sheer scale of the financial fraud and the flight risk posed by her consultant friend, who had been caught at Teterboro Airport trying to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. But the real work was happening at the estate. I sat in the gallery, the room where Diane had hung those massive, erased canvases. I had a team of tech specialists with me, the real kind, not the ones Diane had hired. Can you recover them? I asked the lead technician, a woman with neon green hair and a no-nonsense attitude. Nodded. She didn't delete the originals, Claire. She was too arrogant for that. She kept them in a hidden partition on the house server. I think she liked knowing the real versions existed. It made her feel more powerful to know she had the power to hide them. At first, I thought I wanted the photos back exactly as they were. But as I watched the images flicker back to life on the monitors, my face reappearing next to my father's, the reflections in the glass being restored, the shadows returning to the sand, I realized that normal wasn't enough. I called my father into the room. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, but his eyes were clear. We're not just putting the old photos back, Dad, I told him. What do you mean? Diane wanted a clean aesthetic, I said, a small, sharp smile playing on my lips. So let's give her one. But we're going to do it the right way. 1 month later, the Sterling estate was hosting another event, but this one was different. It wasn't a gala, it was a liquidation auction. Every single piece of furniture Diane had picked out, every modern sculpture she had commissioned, and every single one of those massive, high-gloss canvases was being sold. The proceeds were going to a foundation for victims of domestic and financial abuse, a foundation I had set up in my mother's name. The erased photos were the highlight of the night. But they weren't for sale. They were on display as a study in digital deception. I had curated the exhibit myself. Each canvas was rigged with a motion sensor. When a guest stood in front of one of Diane's perfect photos, the image would slowly dissolve, revealing the reality underneath the stolen funds, the forged signatures, and the moments where I had been digitally removed. It was a public, permanent record of her failure. Then I realized what the final piece of the puzzle was. Diane's legal team had sent a representative to the auction to salvage her personal belongings. Among them was a heavy, locked vanity chest from the master suite. I have a court order to take this, the lawyer said, puffing out his chest. Go ahead, I said, leaning against the marble pillar. But you might want to check the contents first. My father has already exercised his right of reclaim for any items purchased with stolen sterling funds. The lawyer opened the chest. Inside weren't jewels or designer watches. Inside were hundreds of physical copies of the photos Diane had tried to erase. She hadn't been able to bring herself to destroy them. She had kept them like trophies, tucked away in the dark. But there was something else at the very bottom of the chest. A small, black USB drive with a handwritten label, Lucid. I took the drive to my father's study. We sat together, the same way we used to when I was a child, and he would read me stories. I plugged it in. It wasn't a bank statement. It wasn't a forgery. It was a video file, dated to days before my mother passed away. The video started. My mother was sitting in the garden, the same one from the FaceTime thumbnail. She looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. "Arthur," she said to the camera, "if you're watching this, it means you've forgotten how to look. You've always been a man of industry, my love, but you've never been a man of detail. That's why I've left Claire the locket. And that's why I've left a ghost in the system." She smiled that same secret joy. "I know you'll marry again. You're not meant to be alone. But if the person you choose tries to change the story, the ghost will wake up. Claire is my daughter. She sees what others miss. Trust her, Arthur. She's the only one who can see the truth in the glass." The video faded to black. My father was sobbing quiet, soul-cleansing sobs. He reached out and touched my hand, his grip firm and desperate. "She knew," he choked out. "She knew I'd be a fool. She knew you'd need a reminder," I said softly. I walked out of the estate that night for the last time. Not because I was being kicked out, but because the house no longer felt like a cage of glass. It felt like a building. My father was moving into a smaller place, something with more wood and less marble. The estate was being sold to a museum. As I walked down the grand staircase, I stopped in front of the foyer mirror. I looked at the silver locket around my neck. I opened it and looked at my mother's portrait. I realized then that Diane hadn't just been trying to erase me. She had been trying to erase the truth. But the truth isn't a digital file. It isn't a line in a will or a pixel on a canvas. That's when I realized what was happening. I whispered to the empty hallway. The truth is the thing that remains when everything else is stripped away. It's the shadow on the sand that can't be edited. It's the reflection in the glass that no one thinks to check. I stepped out into the cool night air. My car was waiting. I had a final year of law school to finish, a foundation to run, and a life to live, a life that was no longer a secret. I saw Diane one last time during the sentencing hearing. She looked small in her orange jumpsuit, her designer hair replaced by a matted mess, her emerald eyes dull and defeated. She tried to catch my eye, probably hoping for a spark of anger, a sign that she still had power over me. I didn't give it to her. I didn't even look at the defense table. I just sat in the gallery, my mother's locket resting against my heart, and watched as the judge read the list of her crimes. She thought she was a master of the narrative. She thought she could rewrite a family's history with a few clicks of a mouse. But here is the thing about people who try to erase others. They eventually find that they've erased themselves. Diane didn't just lose the money. She didn't just lose the status. She lost her existence. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the public, and in the eyes of the man she tried to manipulate, she was now the one who didn't fit the aesthetic. Sometimes karma doesn't need a grand gesture. Sometimes it doesn't need a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes karma just needs someone to stop walking, wait for the dust to settle, and point to the empty space where the truth was hiding all along. I drove away from the courthouse, the city skyline stretching out before me like a fresh, unedited canvas. The picture was finally complete. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be,